a cliff face in the Deccan Plateau of western India. Basalt, dark and volcanic, cut by monsoon rivers for millions of years before anyone touched it with a chisel. Somewhere in the 8th century, a king decided to build a temple here, not beside the mountain, inside it. Most temples rise from the ground up, block by block, mistake correctable at every stage. This one was cut from the top down, out of a single standing mass of rock, with no second chances built into the method at all. One wrong strike, low enough in the structure, and centuries of work would have to be abandoned entirely. It was never abandoned. What stands there today is still the largest monolithic structure ever carved by human hands. Not assembled, not built. Subtracted, piece by piece, from a mountain that had not moved in millions of years. Roughly 34 kilometers from the modern city of Aurangabad, in the Indian state of Maharashtra, a stretch of basalt escarpment holds 34 separate sanctuaries, each one cut directly into the same cliff. These are the Ellora caves. Not one religious tradition, but 3, carved side by side across the same rock face. Buddhist monasteries and prayer halls, Hindu temples dedicated to Shiva and Vishnu, Jain sanctuaries with their own distinct iconography. Different faiths, different centuries in some cases, all choosing the same mountain, all leaving their work in the same stone. That alone would make Ellora significant. A single cliff, used continuously across centuries by builders who did not share a religion but shared a method. Rock removed rather than stone added. A sanctuary revealed rather than constructed. Among those 34 structures, one stands apart from every other. It carries a simple designation in the archaeological record. Cave 16. Its actual name is the Kailasa Temple. Dedicated to Shiva, built to represent Mount Kailash itself, the peak in the Himalayas that Hindu tradition holds as Shiva's own dwelling place. A temple built not simply near a mountain, but built as a mountain, deliberately. The numbers involved are worth stating precisely, because they are the kind of numbers that sound exaggerated until you actually stand in front of them. The temple complex runs roughly 84 meters in length, roughly 47 meters across. Its central tower, the Shikara, rises close to 30 meters above the courtyard floor beneath it. That makes it, in footprint alone, larger than the Parthenon in Athens. A 3-story structure, multiple shrines, a full courtyard, and all of it, every wall, every pillar, every carved surface, is not stone that was cut somewhere else and hauled to this location. It is a single continuous piece of mountain. It has never been moved. It is still attached at its base to the same bedrock it was cut from over 1,000 years ago. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it separates Kailasa from almost every other large structure built anywhere in the ancient world. The Egyptian pyramids were assembled. The cathedrals of medieval Europe were assembled, stone by stone, transported and stacked and mortared into place. Kailasa was never assembled at all. Nothing was brought to the site. Nothing was added. The entire structure existed in its final form, somewhere inside the raw mass of the cliff before a single chisel ever touched it. The builder's task was not construction in the way that word is normally used. It was subtraction, removing everything that was not the temple until only the temple remained. That is a genuinely different category of building than anything else on this list of ancient wonders, and it demands a genuinely different method of construction, one with essentially no room for correction once work had actually begun. Understanding exactly how that method worked, how a team of builders could plan and execute a structure this large, this precise, while cutting downward into solid rock with no way to add material back if something went wrong, requires looking directly at the engineering itself. Because nothing about the way Kailasa was built resembles ordinary construction anywhere else in the ancient world, and the method itself is where the real difficulty of this project actually begins. Most construction in any era moves in one direction, up. A foundation goes down first, and everything else rises from it, layer by layer, with the option to adjust, reinforce, or rebuild any given section without disturbing what has already been finished elsewhere. Kailasa did not work that way. The builders began at the top of the cliff and worked their way down. That single reversal is the reason this structure occupies its own category among ancient monuments. The first stage of construction did not involve carving the temple itself at all. It involved isolating it. Laborers cut 3 deep vertical trenches directly into the basalt face of the cliff, working from above, separating a single rectangular mass of stone from the surrounding mountain on 3 sides. That isolated block, still solid rock at this stage, still entirely part of the cliff, was roughly the size of the finished temple that would eventually emerge from inside it. Nothing had been shaped yet. The material had only been set apart. From there, the actual carving proceeded downward, layer by layer, working from the top of that isolated stone mass toward the ground. There was no scaffolding rising up from below to support the work, the way scaffolding supports construction on a conventional building site. There was no way to add material back to a section once it had been removed. Every measurement, every proportion, every angle of every wall and pillar had to be planned and confirmed before the first strike of the chisel, because a mistake made low in the structure could not be patched, repositioned, or quietly corrected later. It could only be worked around, if it could be worked around at all, or it would compromise everything built above it that had already been finished. Think about what that actually demands from a design process. A conventional builder can adjust a plan mid-construction, respond to an unexpected flaw in the material, correct an error discovered partway through. The builders of Kailasa did not have that option. The entire structure, every interior chamber, every connecting passage, every sculptural detail had to exist first as a complete plan in the minds of the people executing it, because the stone itself offered no second attempt. The physical evidence of that method is still visible today, more than 1,000 years later. Drill and chisel marks remain cut directly into the walls surrounding the temple, the literal fingerprints of the tools used to remove the rock, preserved in the same basalt the builders were working. Nothing about that evidence points toward any process more complicated than sustained, skilled, disciplined human labor, applied over a very long period of time by people who understood exactly what they were doing before they ever began doing it. A method with zero margin for error, executed at this scale, could not have been carried out by a small crew working quickly. It demanded a substantial, sustained workforce, and it demanded time, considerably more time than most construction projects of any era typically require. The written historical record only partially preserves exactly how much of either was actually needed, but the physical scale of what was removed from that cliff gives a real, measurable sense of the labor involved, and that number, on its own, is worth sitting with directly. Here is the number that anchors everything else about this project. Estimates place the total volume of rock removed from the cliff somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 tons of solid basalt. Hold that figure directly, because a number that large is genuinely difficult to picture without something to measure it against. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the most labor-intensive construction projects in the ancient world, was assembled from roughly 2 million individually cut and transported stone blocks, each one quarried elsewhere, moved to the site, and stacked into position. Kailasa involved no transportation at all. Nothing was quarried somewhere else and hauled in. The material removed from that cliff was subtracted directly from a single mass of stone that never moved from where it had always stood, going back millions of years before a single person ever touched it with a tool. Consider what that distinction actually means for the labor involved. Moving 2 million pre-cut blocks into position is an enormous undertaking, but it is fundamentally a transportation and assembly problem. Removing 400,000 tons of rock from a solid cliff face by hand, with no powered tools of any kind, no explosives, no mechanized drilling, is a fundamentally different kind of problem. It is raw, sustained, controlled labor, applied precisely enough that the finished shape underneath all that removed material came out exactly as planned. The tools available to the builders were simple by any modern standard. Iron chisels, hammers, nothing more sophisticated than that. An unknown but clearly substantial number of laborers worked in a controlled, planned sequence, removing rock in a specific order at a specific pace, guided by a design that had to remain consistent across the entire length of the project. Historians estimate the construction spanned several decades at an absolute minimum. It quite possibly spanned considerably longer than that, potentially extending across more than a single generation of laborers, overseers, and the royal patrons who funded the work in the first place. A project of that duration means the people who began cutting those first trenches into the cliff face may never have lived to see the finished temple. The work would have passed from one set of hands to another across years, and the design itself had to remain coherent through every single one of those handoffs, or the final structure would have shown it. That kind of duration, under a single sustained architectural vision, executed by a workforce that changed and turned over across the length of the project, raises an obvious next question. A project this large, this long, this expensive in raw human labor does not happen without direction. Someone had to order it. Someone had to fund it, across however many years it actually took, and someone had to hold the authority necessary to keep an enormous, multi-generational labor force working toward the exact same finished design the entire time. The historical record does point toward a specific answer to that question, but it is worth being direct about exactly how much of that answer is actually confirmed, and how much of it has been reconstructed from evidence that survives only in fragments, because the honest limits of what we actually know matter just as much here as the parts that are genuinely well established. Tradition credits the temple to King Krishna I, ruler of the Rashtrakuta dynasty, reigning roughly between 756 and 773 CE. During that period, Rashtrakuta power controlled a substantial stretch of the Deccan Plateau, the same broad region where Ellora itself sits, and a project of this scale would have required exactly the kind of sustained royal authority and resources a dynasty at the height of its regional power could actually provide. That attribution is the accepted historical position. It is worth being direct, though, about exactly how solid the evidence behind it actually is, because the honest limits of the record matter here just as much as what the record does confirm. No detailed on-site construction record survives describing the project stage by stage. There is no single surviving document that lays out when work began, how it was funded year to year, or exactly how authority over the project passed between rulers if it did pass at all. What survives instead are later inscriptions connected to the Rashtrakuta dynasty, referencing an extraordinary temple built at a site the inscriptions call Ellora, an old regional name for the area around Ellora. Those inscriptions are genuine historical evidence. They are not, however, a construction manual. They confirm that a temple of real significance existed at this location, connected to Rashtrakuta patronage, within a plausible historical window. They do not confirm the exact year construction began, the exact number of years it took, or the precise sequence of decisions made along the way. One detail within that later inscriptional record is worth stating directly, because it captures something the dry historical facts alone cannot. One inscription reportedly records the architect's own reaction to the finished structure, wondering, in his own words, how he himself had actually managed to build it. Sit with that for a moment. This is not a modern observer expressing disbelief at ancient engineering from a distance of over 1,000 years. This is, according to the record, the person directly responsible for the design, looking at his own completed work and finding it difficult to fully account for what he had accomplished. That detail is evidence of something real. Contemporary astonishment recorded close to the time of construction itself, from someone with direct, first-hand knowledge of exactly how the project had actually been carried out. It is not, on its own, proof of anything supernatural or inexplicable about the method used. It is proof that even the people who built Kailasa understood, at the time, that what they had accomplished was extraordinary. What it is not is a substitute for the missing construction record. The exact sequence of decisions made throughout the project, the precise size of the workforce at any given point, whether the temple was built under one continuous royal patron or passed between successive rulers as the Rashtrakuta dynasty itself changed hands, all of that remains reconstructed from indirect evidence rather than confirmed by any single surviving account. That gap in the written record, the space between what is genuinely documented and what has simply been inferred from later inscriptions and the physical structure itself, is precisely where modern speculation about the temple's true origin has grown loudest. And that speculation deserves to be addressed directly, rather than dismissed without examination or quietly ignored altogether. That gap in the written record has become, in the modern era, fertile ground for a very specific kind of speculation. A structure this large, executed with this level of precision, using tools this simple, strikes many modern observers as implausible on instinct alone. And where instinct runs ahead of evidence, explanations tend to follow that reach considerably further than the historical record actually supports. Ancient astronauts, lost advanced civilizations, technology no serious archaeological evidence has ever actually documented anywhere at this site or any comparable one. It is worth addressing that directly, rather than dismissing it without examination, because the actual evidence available genuinely does settle the question, and it settles it plainly. Ellora was never an isolated, unprecedented act of construction, appearing suddenly with no clear origin. It sits inside an established, centuries-long tradition of rock-cut architecture across the Indian subcontinent, a tradition with a long, well-documented developmental history stretching back well before Kailasa was ever conceived. Look directly at the other 33 caves, sharing that exact same cliff face. Dozens of separate structures, built by the same evolving community of artisans working across generations, show a clear, traceable progression in skill, technique, and architectural ambition, moving steadily forward through time. Earlier caves at the site demonstrate simpler excavation methods, more modest scale, less structurally daring design. Later caves show increasing confidence, increasing complexity, increasing precision in exactly the kind of top-down, error-intolerant carving technique that Kailasa would eventually push to its absolute limit. The builders of Cave 16 were not working from nothing. They were not improvising a method never attempted before, with no accumulated institutional knowledge to draw on. They were the most advanced expression of a craft tradition that had already been refined, generation after generation, on that exact same stretch of rock, by artisans who had spent decades solving smaller versions of exactly the same engineering problems Kailasa would eventually require them to solve at a far greater scale. That progression is not speculation. It is directly visible, cave by cave, in the archaeological record preserved at Ellora itself, available for anyone to examine directly at the site today. A visitor can walk the same cliff face and see, structure by structure, exactly how the skill required to build something like Kailasa actually developed over time, rather than appearing suddenly, fully formed, from nowhere. None of that diminishes what was ultimately accomplished. If anything, understanding the genuine developmental history behind Kailasa makes the final achievement considerably more impressive, not less. It represents the accumulated expertise of an entire regional tradition, refined across generations, brought together under sustained royal patronage and pushed to its absolute technical limit in a single, unrepeated project. The temple does not require an explanation reaching beyond ordinary human skill, ordinary human ambition, and an enormous, sustained labor force operating under committed royal patronage across several decades at minimum. What it required was patience, precision, institutional knowledge passed carefully from one generation of artisans to the next, and a level of collective discipline that modern observers, encountering the finished result all at once, rather than watching the centuries of preparation that made it possible, sometimes find genuinely difficult to fully credit. Extraordinary is the correct word for what stands at Ellora today. Inexplicable is not, and the evidence does not support treating it that way. Even setting aside the question of who built Kailasa and why, a considerable amount about the project itself remains genuinely unresolved. It is worth stating that plainly, rather than presenting this account as a fully closed case, because the honest limits of the evidence deserve the same direct treatment here as everywhere else in this story. The exact number of years the project actually took is still reconstructed rather than confirmed. Historians can offer reasonable estimates based on the volume of material removed in comparable rock-cut projects elsewhere at Ellora, but no surviving record states a precise start date and completion date for Kailasa specifically. The precise size of the labor force at any given point during construction is similarly estimated rather than documented, and whether the work proceeded without interruption across those decades or was instead carried out in separate distinct phases under successive Rashtrakuta rulers as political authority shifted, remains an open question the physical evidence alone cannot fully settle. Beyond the raw questions of timeline and labor, the temple's own internal complexity raises its own separate category of open question, one worth sitting with directly rather than moving past quickly. Kailasa is not simply a large, impressive single chamber cut into rock. It contains multiple interior levels connected by internal passages. Bridges carved directly from the same stone link separate structural elements together. The courtyard surrounding the temple holds life-sized sculptural elephants carved with the same permanence, the same total absence of room for correction as everything else on the site. And remarkably, for a structure this old, the temple includes a functioning drainage system, engineered directly into the stone itself, specifically designed to channel monsoon rainwater away from the temple's interior chambers during the region's heavy seasonal rains. Think about what that specific detail actually demands from the original planning process. A drainage system is not a decorative feature. It has to work correctly, under real hydraulic pressure, the very first time it is tested by an actual monsoon, because there is no way to redesign the water flow of a structure carved from solid rock after the fact. The entire hydraulic logic of the temple, every channel, every slope, every point where water needed to move away from the interior rather than pooling inside it, had to be correctly calculated and planned before a single trench was ever cut into the cliff face. A mistake in that specific piece of planning would not simply have been inconvenient, the way a plumbing error might be inconvenient in an ordinary building that can be repaired. It would have been permanent, carved directly into the mountain the same way everything else about the temple was permanent, with no later correction genuinely possible once the stone itself had already been removed. What survives at Ellora today, given everything still unresolved about exactly how and exactly when it was actually built, is not simply a monument standing as a curiosity from the ancient world. It stands as direct, physical evidence of a civilization's confidence at a specific point in its own history that this level of precision, sustained continuously across decades, executed by a changing workforce with no possibility of correction built into the method at any stage, was genuinely achievable. Not theoretically achievable, actually physically achieved and still standing more than 1,000 years later, exactly where it was carved. Return to the basalt cliff face outside Aurangabad, to the trench marks still visible in the surrounding stone, to a temple that has stood essentially unmoved and unmodified since somewhere in the 8th century. It was never built. It was revealed, subtracted directly out of a mountain that had stood in that exact spot for millions of years before anyone touched it. No written manual survives to explain exactly how it was planned, only the astonishment of the one architect whose reaction happened to be recorded, wondering at his own work. What remains is not a mystery requiring an explanation beyond human hands. It is evidence of exactly what those hands were capable of, working patiently, without the possibility of a second attempt, one chisel strike at a time, for as long as it actually took.